Yo, what's up, Sci-Fam? It's your boy Nickel. Today, we're going to learn about carbohydrates. So you can see how we're going to organize our page, so you can kind of plan accordingly. We'll look at different types of carbohydrates, their structure, and then also how they're digested, and we'll also look at the role that insulin plays in the process of getting carbohydrates into our cells. So let's begin there. We need to first recall that carbohydrates are our cellular energy source. And this energy source into our cells is through cellular respiration. And cellular respiration occurs in our mitochondria. Remember, cellular respiration is that glucose plus oxygen allows us to create ATP in our cells in the mitochondria. And as our waste products, we excrete CO2 and H2O. So in order to kick that all off, we need oxygen and glucose. So we're looking at glucose because glucose is an example of a carbohydrate. So speaking of glucose, let's look at the two different types of carbohydrates. One of those is known as a monosaccharide. Now, monosaccharides are things such as glucose, as I was just discussing. Another monosaccharide is known as galactose. And a final is known as fructose. Now you can see they all end in that OSE, which lets us know that it's some type of monosaccharide. Now, glucose, galactose, and fructose are all just the same chemical structure, or at least the elements that make it up are the exact same. But the structure of them, the way that they're actually organized in the shape, is a little bit different. So if you were to look at just the chemical formula of these three monosaccharides, you would see that all of them are in the form of C6H12O6. But each of them are going to be organized and organizing those elements in different formations, which makes them different molecules. Now, monosaccharides are the simplest form of carbohydrates. The ones that are the most complex are not mono, which means one saccharide, but poly, which means many saccharides. So a polysaccharide would be another type of carbohydrate. So some polysaccharides that some examples here are something like amylose starch. So if you've ever heard of a starch before, starches are carbohydrates, and they're specifically a polysaccharide. And this is because, you see, poly means many, meaning that there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of those monosaccharides connected together to make amylose starch. So if we look at the chemical formula for amylose starch, it would be something like C14H26O11. So you can see there's a lot more going on in these polysaccharides. Another one would be known as glycogen. Glycogen's chemical formula would be C24H42O21. So you can see, again, it's way more complex than that monosaccharide, which is just C6H12O6. These polysaccharides are many of those monosaccharides connected together. The third and final polysaccharide that we'll investigate here is cellulose. And cellulose has a chemical formula that would be C12H22O11. Now, these polysaccharides can be categorized into two different sections. One type of polysaccharide is known as a starch, and a different type of polysaccharide is known as fiber. So you may have heard of foods that are starches or foods that are have a lot of fiber in them, and we'll kind of look at right now what the difference is between a starch and a fiber, and why fiber, for example, is something that's boasted as being a positive thing that helps with digestion of food. So before we jump into fiber, let's first look at starch. Now, since it's a polysaccharide, it is essentially a bunch of hexagons that are connected together. So I'm drawing myself just a few hexagons here that I will connect through a bond. But see, I'm going to draw a letter in between this bond, and the letter that I'm going to put here that bonds them together is going to be the letter A. So if I were to continue on, we would see that there's this A bond in between all of the different hexagons. And that A bond right there is known as an alpha bond. But here, we're not even going to call it a bond because you see, starches are hardly held together with these bonds. So instead, we call these alpha linkages, or an alpha linkage. And alpha linkages can be broken into monosaccharides. Alpha linkages allow each of those individual hexagons to be broken up. Each hexagon is a monosaccharide. So when we have a starch, starches can be broken into monosaccharide pieces in the small intestine of our bodies. You see, this is important because monosaccharides are the things that need to be able to get into our cells to give our cells the energy they need. It's that C6H12O6. And each of these monosaccharides has this type of hexagonal type of shape. However, each of the types of monosaccharides that we've discussed, the glucose, galactose, and fructose, each are going to organize their auxiliary elements in a little bit different organizations. But for our model here of starch, you can see there's several hexagons bound together with alpha linkages, and those alpha linkages are easy to break apart. So once the starch gets into our small intestine just starts to go ahead and break those apart and sends each of those monosaccharides to our cells where they can go through cellular respiration and give us ATP energy. Now, fiber is going to be a bit different. You see, it still has those hexagon shapes that are going to be bound together, but now they're going to be bound with something that I'm calling a B bond. So I'm going to draw the letter B there, and I'm going to connect a bunch of these hexagons. Remember, these hexagons are monosaccharides. So fiber is also made out of monosaccharides that have all been bound together with this B bond. And this B bond in fiber is known as a beta bond. And a beta bond is something that cannot be broken apart. It is indigestible. And if we can't break it apart and use each of those monosaccharides for our cellular energy, then our body just goes ahead and converts that into, into our poop. So fiber, a diet high in fiber, actually helps you stay regular, because that's just a bunch of stuff that our body can't digest, and so we send it out in our excretion. All right, so if we review here, we have carbohydrates that can be broken into two categories. The simple ones are monosaccharides, and when you connect a bunch of monosaccharides together, you get polysaccharides. Poly means many. And these polysaccharides, when they go into our small intestine to be digested, the starches are broken apart so that each of those monosaccharides are released and sent to our cells to go through cellular respiration. And the fiber can't be broken down. It's indigestible, and it's just excreted through our poop. So let's identify two parts of carbohydrate digestion. Two important things that are critical for us to know as we follow the path of carbohydrates after they've been eaten. So when we look at carbohydrate digestion, we're going to start with monosaccharides. So either we ate monosaccharides or we ate a starch that gets converted into monosaccharides, and those monosaccharides then are sent from the small intestine to the liver. The liver is very important in our digestive processes here. So monosaccharides are sent from the small intestine to the liver through the portal vein. Now, once they arrive at the liver, either the liver's going to use them or send them out into our blood. So the liver is kind of the gatekeeper as to what's going to happen with those monosaccharides. So the second step is just that. The monosaccharides, which are now traveling from our small intestine into our liver, and it has to get there through our blood. So since these monosaccharides are things like glucose, galactose, fructose, these are known as, in our common language, just sugar, and they're traveling in our blood. So these monosaccharides, we could just say that this is blood sugar. So you eat some food, whether it's monosaccharides or polysaccharides, gets digested into the little pieces known as monosaccharides. That's known as our blood sugar. So sugar's traveling in our blood, and it's used by the liver. So the liver's like, ooh, I need energy. I'm going to go ahead and use these monosaccharides in the blood sugar in order to create energy. And if the liver doesn't need energy, then the monosaccharides are sent to the rest of our body. Our other tissues, our other muscles, our other fat cells, so that those cells can go through cellular respiration. And then those cells can get the energy that they need. But we have to make sure that our liver is functioning well. So the liver has priority with our monosaccharides, and if our liver is not using those monosaccharides, then the monosaccharides are sent to the rest of the body for cellular respiration, so that the other cells in our body can create that ATP energy. Now, once those monosaccharides travel through our blood and are going to the other cells, they arrive at a cell, and glucose on its own, or a monosaccharide on its own, arrives at the cell and it just bounces off. You see, it needs help to get into the cell. It can't just get in on its own, even though the mitochondria really, really, really want that glucose so that it can create energy, because they really want that ATP energy, but the glucose can't get to the mitochondria, except for with the help of our shining star. This here is insulin. You see, insulin is actually a hormone which is produced in the pancreas, and this hormone is what's needed for glucose, or monosaccharides, for glucose to be able to enter our cells. And once it enters the cells, then those mitochondria can go through and make ATP. So let's add some of these yellow portals here, which I'm calling insulin. So let's add some of these insulin portals into our cell. If we add them into our cell, then miraculously we should have the ability for the glucose then to enter the cell. You see, cells have to be protective because they only want glucose to come in if they need it. So when they do need it, they allow the insulin to create the pathway for glucose to get inside of the cell, where it can then go to the ATP, to the mitochondria, to make the ATP energy. And the glucose can travel through the insulin. It has to go through the insulin. And if the insulin is not there, then glucose is unable to get inside of the cell to make the ATP energy. So insulin is really important. It's a hormone produced by the pancreas, and it works with a cell to allow the glucose to come in for ATP energy to occur. So we need insulin in order to digest those carbohydrates, and those carbohydrates get digested in our small intestine into the monosaccharides. As long as it's a starch, but it's a fiber, that fiber is indigestible, and it just goes into our